Today is March 14th, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm here with Tony Hilliard, who is also a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center. And we're honored to have with us today Mr. Nathan Crutchfield. Mr. Crutchfield has kindly agreed to share his story with us about his military experience and his life. This is part of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project and the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association Veterans Legacy Project. Mr. Crutchfield, we are honored to have you here today, and we really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Could you give us your full name and your date of birth?
Ervin Nathan Crutchfield, and I was born on November the 24th, 1947.
Okay. And where were you born?
Here in Atlanta.
Okay. And what is your current address?
In Fayetteville, Georgia.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
I was, like I said, born in Atlanta. My mother's family has been in Atlanta for decades, if not since the 1830s, when the family moved into the area over in Morrow, Georgia. I grew up on the south side of Atlanta in the Perkison Park area, attended Perkison Elementary. We moved out towards the South Fulton area when I was just about to go to high school. I attended Campbell of Fairburn and graduated from Campbell of Fairburn in 1965. So I did the basic stuff you do in high school, played football, played various sports in the band, and then participated in the usual things that high schoolers are wont to do. So after attending Campbell of Fairburn, I went on to Southern Tech, which is now Southern Polytech up in Marietta, and picked up an associate degree in surveying and construction. So that's what that was the direction I thought I wanted to go in at that point in time in my life. And like I said, got the two-year degree, which is what the school had to offer at that time. And as soon as I got my degree, a 1A came in the mail and let me know that I was subject to the draft immediately. Now, up to that point, most of us were just keeping track of the newspaper and what was shown on the TVs. The TV stations at the time about what was going on in the country. And
meaning in Vietnam.
Meaning Vietnam. We saw the newsreels that were coming across, that sort of thing. So as soon as I got my degree, I got thinking about what were my options. I could join the Marine Corps, I could join the Air Force, could wait for the draft and take my chances with what the draft had to offer. And researching it out, I guess in my own way, at the age I was, the Army had a 3-year option, which was, I figured, well, 3 years is pretty good. And the Marines and the Air Force were 4, and the Navy was 4. And also, you couldn't get into the Air Force or the Navy at that time. They had a pretty good waiting list. And so I went down to the recruiting station. I believe it was in College Park or East Point. I think it was in East Point, Georgia, and enlisted. The enlistment sergeant, I still remember his last name was Faust. So I had Sergeant Faust enlisted me, and basically I signed a contract with 3 options. One was to be a topographical land surveyor. The second option was to be an artillery surveyor, and the third was needs of the U.S. Army. So it was a delayed enlistment, so I continued working. At that point in time, I was working for the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration as probably about what's the lowest level you can get, GS1 or something like that, just like an intern. And then on May 1, I entered the Army and took basic training at Fort Benning. So, and so that was the May throughout the summer, taking the basic training at Benning. We were still using the M14 down there at that point in time, and only at the last, I guess it was the following year after OCS, we got into the 16. But at any rate, did the basic training at Benning. Went to, at that point, directly over to Fort Leonard Wood, which is 106 miles due west of St. Louis, and did combat engineer training. Now, what I left out was while in basic, they run you through a bunch of tests and different skill sets and abilities testing, and I was able to be offered officers candidate school. So I, at that point during basic training, voided out my contract to be a land surveyor, and the intent was to go to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and become an engineering officer, be part of the Corps of Engineers. And at that point, I thought that'd be pretty good. I'd be look good on my resume to have been in the Army Corps of Engineers. Leonard Wood was an interesting post. The combat engineers were the ones that did all the mine laying, did all the entrenchments, and do a lot of the basic stuff. And in Vietnam, they're the ones who would go in before the infantry and clear the LZs, which I never had figured out. But at any rate, it had some real interesting times there at Fort Leonard Wood, mainly not ever leaving the post except one time because there was not much off post, and a crew of us went over to St. Louis and went up in the newly opened arch and did a few things and hustled back to the Fort Leonard Wood. Most of the time I was saving my money because I knew I was going to have to buy all my uniforms for OCS at Fort Belvoir. A bunch of us sat around one day, got our orders, and we're comparing notes about when we were going to be at Belvoir, and each of the guys gave Belvoir on this date, that date, and the other, and came around to me and said Fort Benning. And I looked at the other guys and said, you know, I didn't know there was an engineering unit at Fort Benning. And the guys just fell over laughing, and I said, son, you're in the infantry. So that ended my tour of duty in the combat engineers at that point in time. I was now en route to infantry OCS at Fort Benning. So at the end of the summer, there was a brief, it seemed very brief, just the leave you got, normal leave, and I entered the 63rd Company OC, nicknamed the Highlanders, at Fort Benning in Officers Candidate School. The reason it was called the Highlanders is that particular Officers Candidate company had been adopted by the Black Watch of Canada. So we had a big mural of the Black Watch doing something in North America, you know, back about the French and Indian War on the cafeteria wall. And in fact, during one of the banquets they have when you, I think the infantry call it turning blue after a certain point in your time frame with the in the infantry school, there was a large banquet of moving to that different level of the school, and they had, I think, the colonel of the Black Watch came down, and they had a piper, and somebody piped in a haggis, and it was quite a soiree there. Wow. So went to the infantry school throughout all the 26, it was 26 weeks at the time. So, and on graduation from infantry OCS, had a brief leave and was reassigned back to the Officers Candidate School as what's called a tactical officer. So that meant I had to go through the program a second time. Essentially, you're a drill sergeant for officers candidates is what it amounts to, and your job is to evaluate all the candidates that are there, and every day you have to do a little bit of an evaluation and recommend who should stay and who should leave. And actually it's the worst job in the world because you are up before the OCs are up, and you've got to be spit shined and look better than an officer's candidate is supposed to look. And then when at the end of all the training, you're running with them throughout the fort to different training sites throughout. And at the end of the day, you have to go back to your apartment because you now have to take care of your own quarters because you've got your commission, and you wind up having to do all your paperwork. So I got about 4 hours sleep a night there for a number of nights. But along this way, we talk about the OCS. While I'm staying in trying to stay in that particular time zone, I met my future wife, and in fact, she came down for one of these banquets that they had, and was my date for the item I mentioned, where they had the haggis and the piper and all that coming over. So we were able to date there, and then on graduation, my parents came down and were able to see me graduate down there at Fort Benning. And I know it gave my father a great deal of pleasure. He was a World War II vet and served in the Army Air Corps, and he was in Okinawa and Saipan with the Air Corps out that way.
So how did they feel about you going into the Army at the time?
Actually, it's kind of interesting. I don't recall anything negative being said, or any like my mother being upset, or they took it pretty stoically. My father, having been a veteran, we've had relatives that have been in the Air Force and in the Army, different cousins and that sort of thing. I don't, I think they asked a few questions about, when did you do this? Because I just went up and did it. I just went down to the recruiting station and signed on. But I don't remember any negative. It was almost like it was a duty to do it. And they were still of that generation, and we were still of that generation. And at that point in time, my two closest friends in high school, one had joined the Air Force, and one was a Marine. An interesting side story about those two guys, Robert and Vance. One was in the Air Force, one in the Marines. Both of them became crash crew. And they stayed in the reserves after they got out of their active duty and remained crash crew, and their last duty station was up here in Marietta.
How about, would you explain what crash crew?
Oh, they were the firemen that would go when a plane crashed, when a jet didn't make it off the runway or came in hot and had a serious situation. They were the guys that would respond and save the pilot, put out the flames, and do what they could to mitigate the situation. So, okay. But they were already in, and I was the third of the group, so it was almost like a duty to go and sign up.
Yeah. So. Now, where did you go after Fort Benning?
Well, like I say, I stayed at Fort Benning as a TAC officer, and when I rotated out of that, I was pretty much an aide in some of the training that was ongoing. I remember one little incident there. They were doing the maneuvers over between Benning and Fort Mitchell. There's a lot of areas that they were using at the time to train the 160,000 troops, I think is what it was, down there at that point in time. Very large contingency. We were supposed to be the aggressors and attack an OC position, several of us, and we couldn't get a Jeep or any transportation, so I had a VW at the time. So we went bouncing through the Georgia woods in a VW and did what we were supposed to do, and one of the sentries was an outpost were asleep, so we snuck in and grabbed an 81mm mortar, captured several guys and who complained that we cheated the whole time, and loaded them in the back seat of my, say there was myself and another LT, lieutenant, we loaded them in the back seat of the Volkswagen, and it had an 81mm mortar sticking out the front window. So we went sailing back out of the woods. I was really worried about dropping over a cliff or into a creek or something because we were using like an old train. And it worked out pretty well. VWs were built for that, I guess. So, but that was kind of that was my more interesting escapade after the OC thing, and then moving on. And then at that point, got the orders to go. And I know. I know the parents were upset a little bit about it, and that's obvious, but again, very stoic as best I could tell. It was expected at the time, given that was in '69, and when I had enlisted, Tet Offensive, and I'd gone in, the Tet Offensive of '68 had already happened. And it was a given, being I was an infantry officer, that the orders were going to be there at some point in time.
During your training, did you have access to many troops who had been to Vietnam to hear their experiences?
The captains in charge of the OC companies were veterans for the most part. So, and this was something that was peculiar for the time, I think. They were one or two tour veterans of Vietnam. In fact, when I left the 63rd Company, I got assigned to the 97th Officers Candidate Company in the 9th Brigade. And the first captain, whose name I've forgotten, had been in some extremely major encounters in Vietnam, major battles. And to the point, one of his XO mentioned to us to be careful. He was sometimes traumatized, and you had to be careful because he literally lost his platoon and his good chunk of his company while on, I think he was at Hamburger Hill. I think that was the nickname of the battle. So, but he rotated out. I'm not sure which way he went. The second that came in, I remember him, Captain Kelly Williams, was a Chinook pilot. And he had flown Chinooks and somehow wound up in charge of an OC infantry company. So those are the two. But most of the lieutenants that were there had just come out of officers' candidate school. And that was one of our complaints, is you've put us, who were extremely green, instead of putting us up into a line company where we could meet with the veterans, work with the sergeants and all, we were now assigned back to an OC company and had to go through the program again. And what was really needed was to have lieutenants coming back that had the experience. And one of the things I had, you mentioned dealing with, I had a couple of, I had one guy in particular who'd been in Special Forces E6 and had run an infantry platoon in Vietnam. And I was having to treat him like he, I mean, this was the way the orders went for us. We had to treat him like he had no leadership skills at all when we scored it, because I scored him pretty high on a bunch of stuff, because he'd already run a company, I mean a platoon of infantry in Vietnam, as well as being Special Forces, and had the opportunity to go into officers' candidate school. I scored him about 90 on some leadership skills and wound up in front of the light colonel in charge of the battalion, who explained to me in no uncertain terms that I had blown the curve. And you know, I sat there on my heel, well, not sat, I was standing very rigid in front of him at attention when he was letting me know that I had messed up these statistics, and that the intent was that the first 6 or 8 weeks you were going through, you had no skills, and the second 8 or so weeks you had better leadership skills, and finally you were well trained in leadership quality by the time you graduated. And truth of the matter, these guys should have gotten a direct commission. They had no business being there, you know.
I assume you didn't have a chance to explain your position to him?
I don't think I got a word in edgewise, you know, so there was no explanation whatsoever.
Yeah.
What made it worse, and I was sitting there thinking this, I mean, I was standing there, I keep saying I was sitting in front of him, no, I wasn't. What I remember was the whole time he was letting me know I'd blown the curve, the only thing I can notice is he was wearing what we called PX fatigues, which weren't the Army issue, and they didn't color properly. So they were this odd OD green, and they didn't look right, and the cuffs were different from what the regular issue was. So quite frankly, I was pretty disdainful of a guy that apparently had not even the wherewithal to buy or get the right kind of fatigue. Yeah. So that's the main thing I remember about his little talk to me, other than I was glad to get out of his office.
Yes, I'm sure you were.
But my captain let me know later on, never let that happen again. So everybody failed the next week. But every week we had to go through a drill of rank ordering everybody, and in certain periods through the OC there was what's called a panel assembled, and that panel was officers that interviewed the TAC officers, what we were called, and interviewed the candidate, and if they didn't explain themselves well, they were out of the program. So I think we started out with 200 and some odd folks, and on average graduated about 100.
Wow.
Part of that was physical, part of that was mental. They didn't pass the test because we were at the infantry school. It was like going back to college. You had tests, you had scores, you had classrooms, you had field work. It was pretty rigorous from what I remember. So.
When did you head to Vietnam?
After a leave and some nice early Christmas with the family and all, left for Vietnam around December 12th, 13th of 1969. Okay. Flew out to San Francisco. At that point you traveled not in units like they do now, but by yourself. And in Travis, got with some other guys, we rented a cab and went over, we landed in San Francisco, took a cab over to, I believe it was Travis Air Force Base, and there was at that point they were under contract with an airline called Brantiff. And we flew Brantiff over, I think we stopped in Hawaii and Wake Island, you know, and maybe Guam, I can't remember the exact hops, because coming and going, I've got the islands mixed up. I know we stopped at Wake Island because I remember I didn't think there was ever going to be a runway when we were coming down. What was interesting about the Brantiff plane, it was bright yellow. Brantiff colored its planes, and I thought it was very appropriate for me, you know, in flying into Vietnam. So, but it was a full plane load, and they treated us well going over, and then on in, like say, into Wake Island and on in. So, and I remember Wake Island reading about history and knew what happened there.
Yeah. What was your first impression of Vietnam when you landed?
we were warned about the heat and the humidity and everything, and when I was getting off the plane, the first thing hit me was this was pretty much like Fort Benning in South Georgia. And you know, we could, and I remember seeing some of the Vietnamese apparel, if you would, what the women were wearing over there. They wear an ao dai. I think it's like black. You all hear about the black pajamas that they come, but a black. Usually it was a white top with a black slack. An ao dai was a long flowing. It looked very graceful. So my first thought was, this is, you know, the weather didn't bother me because I was used to Georgia weather. At that point in time, you know, most people didn't have air conditioning at home. I mean, we certainly didn't. You know, central air was very rare. So the temperature and being at Benning and at Fort Leonard Wood, which, you know, neither one was, you know, they didn't bother me all that much. The heat didn't. I never did have any major problems with heat and humidity over there. So,
please talk about your experiences in Vietnam, where you were assigned, what your various missions were, and just the memorable experiences you had during your tour.
Well, I fully expected to be assigned to an infantry unit and be an infantry platoon leader. You go into a deployment center, and they sort everybody out about who's got what and that sort of thing. For some obscure reason, I wound up with the 11th Armored Cavalry, the Black Horse, and got assigned to them. At that point in time, I think there were 6 infantry officers or commissioned officers in the Black Horse. It was considered and still is to a high degree, even though it's the OP4 out at Fort Ervin. It was considered the armor regiment to be in. And I learned later on that if you ever made it to colonel of the regiment, you were destined to become at least 1-star brigadier. In fact, about 2 colonels back was the colonel was Colonel George Patton, who was the son of the Patton. And so he made a name for himself, and it was pretty much a mini clone of his father. And that's not, I don't mean that depreciatingly. Yeah. He had a lot of his father's attributes and all, but he ran, and there were lieutenants I met and captains that had met him and served under him when he was there, because I think there was a Colonel Leach between Patton and the colonel that I served under. So I got assigned to the 11th Armored Cavalry, and at that point got assigned down to what's called the Third Squadron of the 11th, and stayed at the squadron level for, this is where my memory is a little fuzzy, about a month or so. I got actually to the squadron, I think there was a light colonel, I had his name earlier, I've lost it now, Hofmeister or something like that. I'm very close. I thought he was a real good gentleman. He was strict to one degree. They were all patient with this brand newly minted 2nd Lieutenant of Infantry that got stumbled into the TOC area. We had a Major Driscoll, who was a former NFL football player. I think he said he played for either the Browns or St. Louis, and several other captains and all that welcomed me in. So. But my initial duties with them, they really trying to figure out what to do with this guy. He's a lieutenant, of infantry. But anyway, main thing I remember doing early on, I had liaison with a Special Forces camp. We were right at the edge of War Zone C at the time. The little background: the Third Squadron and the regiment in and of itself at that point was assigned north of Saigon, just outside of Cambodia. There's an area we were east of what's called the Black Virgin Mountain, Nui Ba Dien, just outside of the old War Zone C. We operated in the area of An Loc, Loc Ninh, Quan Loy, that area right up along the Cambodian border. So my initial duties was pretty much we took medical teams into villages. There was a lot of that going on at that point in time. So 2 tracks would go in with medics, and we would put out a table and call for any of the, bring out your sick, you're injured, you're ill, and the medics would treat, because there were no doctors in the area. No, there's just no medical base for a lot of the villagers.
So you were treating the local people?
Just local people, yeah. So we did that for a while. I did that for a while. Someone somewhere had the bright idea to start a sniper team concept, where you would have a trained sniper team operate a strategic point, shall we say. The way we operated, where the squadrons each had their area of operation, then each troop of each squadron had 3 troops plus a heavy tank company, but each troop had its own mini AO, and then the platoons would go out and strong point from there. So you could cover a lot of ground with an armored cav unit. So what they did was they set up each squadron was to have a sniper team, and since I was sitting around and needed something to do, they assigned me to have a sniper team, and they put a call out for volunteers, and it was a really eclectic group that came in that I had as a sniper team. And what was really interesting, they all got to go out and train the snipers. They went to the sniper school, which was back in Benoit or somewhere back that way. And I didn't get to go for some obscure reason. The guy in charge didn't get to go. But I had I'm thinking there's about 6 guys on the sniper team. All their names I've forgotten right now. It was a brief period, and the only claim to fame with that is our job was to go out and just move out away from the area. Move. In one case, we were with an infantry company. They put us out. We just went out in the middle of the rubber plantation, and I remember having a sergeant major tell me, "You shouldn't ought to be doing this, Lieutenant." And I said, "Well, they told me to." But anyway, getting in we had a dog team with us, and the dog pointed on something, and we got in a little bit of a firefight, but never saw anything.
Excuse me.
Yeah, and then the other thing was I was assigned to go with I Troop one night, and they put us out, and I picked a fork in a trail, and put my little sniper team in the middle of that. And I remember we tried to dig some holes in the ground, just dug out and try to protect ourselves a little bit. And so it was one of those interesting nights in your life. We had an NVA company digging around us, and somewhere in the middle of the night, I Troop had a trip flare go off and cut loose. And so we never got a shot off that night. But the next morning, one of the guys looked at me and said, "You see them open up that map?" And said, "Who opened up the map?" And said, that NVA officer. So he was about 10 feet from you. Now, what had happened is I'd set a watch. We didn't all try to stay up. What I had is we were real as close as you and I are to each other, or if not closer. Yeah. And our intent was, if we saw something, we'd be able to bring it down, because we carried M14, custom-built M14s with starlights. But what had happened, they were in so close, and the 50 cal and the 60 cal and stuff coming out of I Troop was, I'm trying to remember exactly how far, but the old story about buttons being too thick comes into mind. The main thing I remember about that incident is the captain of I Troop pulled me to the side and really let me know, "Never jam a radio net again, Lieutenant." My RTO had clicked open the handset and unfortunately shut down his net between his tracks. And he let me know that in no certain circumstances. And several decades later, I learned he went on to become I think he made it up to Major General. I'll think of his name here about possibly in a little bit, but he became quite well known there, at least in military circles. But I still remember looking in his eyes. It's kind of like the colonel I told you about earlier, Yeah. So there's a whole trail of those in my life history. So, but that was an interesting night. My major concern was a Cobra gunship rolling in on us, which was called the Blue Max, so we put a strobe light up. We weren't worried about the NVA at that time, or the Viet Cong. We were more worried about we could see the Gatling guns working off that with, like one out of every 5 rounds is a tracer, and we could see that water hose coming at us. That's what it looks like, a red stream of bullets. And so we put that up. But we found base plates to mortars and all sorts of debris around us. They drug off all their wounded, but it was quite a night of laying there, listening.
Wow. Wow.
But that was the main thing. The other thing there, somewhere in that time period, I got sent down to fly with the 8th Tactical Bomber Squadron at the they were down at Benoit. So I got to fly on 2 airstrikes with an Air Force unit, and spent 2 days with them. And it was like they were flying the little I think it's called an A-37 Dragonfly. The little trainer was outfitted to be it could stay on station longer than the F-100s and Phantoms, so we were using that. And so I got to go watch them drop 500-pounders on a position and see what the Air Force did for a couple of days. So I got some pictures of that. It was quite nice, wow. You know. And they were very nice to us at the Air Force. They lived well. Yeah. And, in fact, when we got to there, myself and this other lieutenant got to their headquarters. This colonel invited us in, thanked us for being there, welcomed us, turned to a sergeant, said, "Sergeant, take these men out where they can get a good bath and freshen up." And I remember Jerry, the other lieutenant, looking at me and saying, "You know, I thought we were clean," you know, so because we'd gotten all spiffied up to join the Air Force. So that went on. So that was pretty much it. Then a flare broke up over a track, and a lieutenant at K Troop, which is part of the Third Squadron, he got dusted off from burns from the phosphorus from a flare. And we were in modified 113s, and I'll go into detail about what we had and what I had as a platoon, but phosphorus came through a cargo hatch where he was sleeping, and he got burned, and he went off, and they needed an immediate replacement, and there I was. So I wound up in K Troop 3rd Squadron. And
what was your mission in that assignment? The
mission there was twofold. Early on, and I served with Captain Douglas Campbell. He was there initially. We strong pointed QL-13, which is a highway that went north towards the Cambodian border. And we would strong point, we kind of rotated around. We'd strong point for convoys, meaning as they moved down a highway, we'd have a position that we could respond to a need. Or we would convoy escort, so that would be rotated around. 2 days you might be, or 1 day you might be on strong point, the next day you would be on convoy escort, so you would follow them and be riding with them. And and that was a platoon of armored cavalry, and my platoon consisted of 6 113s, which were personnel carriers, and they were modified with a mine shield on the bottom, mounted as a M60 on either side of the cargo hatch, is what they call a big opening in the center of the 113. The driver had a 50 caliber. Excuse me. The track commander had a 50 caliber. The driver carried an M79 grenade launcher, and lieutenant stood in between the left and the right gunner, and so that I had 6 those ACAVs and 3 Sheridans, which was supposed to be an airdroppable light assault tank or assault vehicle. Had a 153 or a 152 main gun, and so I had 9 vehicles I was responsible for.
Now you had previously, prior to the interview, mentioned being in Cambodia.
Yes.
Could you describe what you did in Cambodia and the situation there at the time?
We did the convoy escort, like I said, and then they started using us to patrol. We call it jungle busting, just move right into the wood line and see what we could find. We did a lot of that as well. So, but one thing I wanted to mention is when I before I get to the Cambodia, before I forget, there was something about. When I got the message or the orders to go and take a platoon at K Troop, what we were also doing is we do the convoy stuff during the day, and then at night we would join up with an infantry fire base, company-sized fire base. They were scattered all over the countryside. We would move into their positions within the fire base, so we would reinforce an artillery fire base. So there'd be 3 105s and a platoon of armored cavalry, and then the infantry company. So the helicopter drops me off with my bag of clothing and that sort of thing, and my rifle and all. And I was greeted by Sergeant First Class Jerry Weath, who was an ancient 33-year-old tanker sergeant. Been to Germany and been in first tour in Vietnam, but I believe so. And to this day, I credit him with a lot of patience and professionalism. He was a true professional soldier. Showed me what the radios and how they would work, because I thought I'd be using a Prick 25, a backpack, when that's what I was trained primarily to use, have an RTO. Assigned me to my track, the lieutenant's track, and I had a good crew. A guy named French and a guy named Kreider, and introduced me to all the platoon at that fire base. I had a lead scout by the name of James O'Brien, and just an excellent lead scout. I'm still in touch with him. He lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Called me this past Sunday, in fact, and we chatted for a little while. Still as mean as a snake, and it's exactly what you wanted in a lead scout. So between those two gentlemen, having a very professional staff sergeant and sergeants in charge of the Sheridans, Cyrus Dodd and John Sokolis and John Booth, I had a great platoon. So, but anyway, we moved in a long march to the Song Bay Bridge. The whole regiment, or the squadron, excuse me, was moving, and we moved to an area called the Song Bay area. And we were over there for like one night, I believe it was, maybe two at the most. And we got orders there's going to be a Cambodian invasion. And at that point, the regiment made the longest road march since World War II, when Patton responded to the Bulge. And so we marched, road marched and went all the way over to outside of Anlock, an area called the Fish Hook. And that's where the regiment and the squadrons of the regiment signed up. And on May 1, the dawn of May 1, we crossed the border at the Fish Hook and moved up towards Sanul. And over several days, we kind of busted our way through pretty heavily powdered area. I mean, they did a B-52 strike prior to we went in, and quite frankly, we had these. We were bouncing off the ground. We were within 6 miles of a B-52 strike, so we definitely heard all that. And there was some artillery and stuff like that. The early May 1, we pulled out of the squadron night position, squadron size, so you can imagine there's a lot of vehicles in that. And you're talking 3 troops of armored cavalry. It was about 27, 30 some odd vehicles. But we moved out, and almost immediately I lost to Sheridan. Or we lost to Sheridan to a mine, because they're on the track we were on. So, but we moved up into Cambodia on that day. So, first day I don't remember too much going on. We had an M48 tank, or 2 M48 tanks that went down. So we had to stay behind. The squadron went on ahead, and we stayed behind one day and provided. K-Troop stayed behind and kept guard on while the mechanics worked on these M48s. And then it was getting dark when we pulled out. They finally got them up and running. We pulled out, started a night march towards to link up with the rest of the squadron. And I remember it was pretty dark, and we were following the track of the left behind, all the armored vehicles going north. And one of these vehicles just been repaired was put up to the front, an M48 tank, and so we're moving through this track about half the width of this room we're in, going north to link up, and the M48 hits a mine. And I just remember seeing a big flash, and again, an extremely good crew. They put out, I don't know how many rounds of 90 millimeter in a big 180-degree arch, and they were still up in the air. I'll never forget that. And with the hydraulic system and M48, they were in a good crew. They just put up a big semicircle arc of fire. We cut loose on either side with our 60s and 50s and that sort of thing. Lead scout pulled up alongside, and part of the crew of the M48 jumped into the track and then moved forward. I got the rest of a couple of the other guys, and then we kept on moving north. And my Sergeant Weath thermited at the command of Captain John Speedy, who was the troop commander at that point. We thermited the last track going out. The last track thermited the M48, and we kept moving north.
Would you explain what thermite means?
It's like, I guess it's a phosphorus-filled grenade, and it burns at a high intensity, so anything, if you launch one of those things or pull the pin on one of them and it goes off, it's just a high intensity, and I believe it's phosphorus that burns through just about anything. So that made anything in that vehicle unworkable or unusable, pretty much melted it down, I suppose. I never saw it. We were just still busting forth.
Were there any casualties as a result of hitting the mine?
I don't recall anyone. We didn't dust anybody off, so there were none that day.
Okay.
And then we moved on up to a strong position, and I remember we posted our guards and let everybody sleep. And after a certain point, I told my track commander, said, "I'm going to take a snooze, wake me up, and I'll take guard at 4." And I remember him shaking me awake at about 6. And I guess he thought we were going to shoot him or something, because he said, "LT, I'm sorry, I fell asleep." And I said, I just looked at him and said, "Well, we've all been up 30-something hours, 24, 30 hours. I forget what it was." I said, "Don't," I just pretty much told him, "Don't worry about it." But I could look on the kid's face, was like, "Oh my God." But I think all of us must have done that, because we were just exhausted. And at that point, we moved up towards Sanul, and it's kind of a blur. I've got the after-action review I've been trying to read and go through and find out where were we. And but we did a lot of patrolling. I remember going out on one patrol. We would strong point. The way we'd work is there'd be the headquarters for the K Troop, the first sergeant and the cooks and the mechanics and the mortar squad, mortar platoon. And then there would be, the captain would take 2 platoons out. We'd go out and patrol whatever the squadron commander wanted us to do based on the orders from the regiment. And so two platoons would go out and patrol with the captain. 1 platoon would stand down and pull maintenance and try to get things reordered and go, and then we'd rotate around like that. So, and sometimes we'd operate independently. The platoon would go out, I'd take my platoon out, be a strong point at some point. Usually at night there might be 1 platoon at the strong point, and then 2 platoons would go out and in other words, you're trying to cover as much ground as you could to prevent infiltration, that sort of thing. So it did have a bouncing Betty go off one day. I remember that. We were driving along on a patrol, and we heard a bang, and we looked over, myself and the 2 gunners looked over to our left, and there's something about the size of a tomato can flickering up in the air, and we wonder what that is. And I think about 100 feet down the road further, it dawned on me we'd just seen one of those devices, and it was a dud and fell back to the ground. Fortunately, we wouldn't be talking.
You're right. You're right.
But so that's the main thing. That was early in the Cambodian thing.
Describe enemy contacts that you experienced in Cambodia.
On or about the 17th of May, we were patrolling, and it's a very scrambled day. We came up on what we believed to be a Khmer Rouge unit. And in fact, and I'm trying to think of which platoon caught it, they caught a Jeep with a bunch of MVA, and rumor has it there was a Chinese advisor with them. Now, I wasn't there, and that was just rumor through the grapevine of what was happening, but one of the tribes, apparently they popped over a hill driving down a road and ran up on one of the armored cav platoons, who immediately fired no telling how many hundreds of rounds at this one little old Jeep. And during that time, we came across a squad in the open. It might have been associated with them. And I remember I had gotten my platoon online. We were in the Rubber Plantation. It's like an orchard. There's rows and rows of rubber trees. And we did a lot of work in the rubber plantations, which the French were still operating. And we went online, and as we went across, this squad moved across to our front, and we just, unfortunately, everybody aimed at one poor guy, and so we got, that's where, my platoon sergeant had jumped out of the track and went and got the AK-47. Now that's what I forgot. At some point in that point, we got into a firefight, and my driver was shot. either he caught a ricochet incoming and hit, because the driver drops down inside when you're in kind of a situation. The driver's on the left front of the ACAB, the old 113. And either he caught a ricochet coming in, or the left gun swung in too close. We're not sure, but all of a sudden we stopped moving and everybody else moving forward, and we realized that he was severely injured, and got the medic on him, got one of the Sheridans, another vehicle, to my vehicle, to take him to an LZ that had been identified to get him dusted off. And I grabbed my, I did carry a Prick 25 because it was just the way we had to have 3 radios. And I grabbed stuff and rifle and ran over to the platoon sergeant's track, got on it, and then we proceeded to move another area of the rubber plantation, and then caught somehow along at that point we caught a number of RPGs that were fired at us, and I say caught, I'm not sure exactly how, what, you know, all of a sudden there was a lot of explosions, and did have one RPG strike my left gunner's gun shield, and I remember him disappearing, and I looked down, he was knocked out at my feet, and I reached over for the M60, and I was going to take it over because my radios were out, and and there was no M60. You know, it's like, oh, now what? So I grabbed a 16 and put a burst next to my sergeant's ear, who was in the cupola, and he got a little upset about that. And then I just essentially did a lot of yelling and jumping up and down. So some point during that whole day, I remember dismounting my platoon before this incident, and my infantry training took over, and I got so mad I just could not get anybody to listen to me about which way the metal boxes were going. So I remember jumping over the side with a rifle and kind of doing hand and arm signals like I was talking to one of my E6s. Got hold of him and said, "Don't you think you ought to be working the radios?" And, you know, reminded me I was now armor, and hauled me back up inside the track, and we went on. So, but that was interesting today. I wound up. This is an attribute to the flying warrant officers we had. We had Loaches, light observation helicopters, and Hueys that were assigned to the squadron. But I got a few. I caught some of the shrapnel, as it turned out, that left when the RPG hit, and the major took had his Loach land in the rubber plantation, and he hops out. The major was what's called the S3, and who helps the colonel on operations, if I recall my nomenclature right. And he jumped out, and I jumped into the Loach, and remember taking off, and my platoon waving fondly at me, to say the least. I gave him a peace sign. They didn't like that. But anyway, I think I did. My memory could be botched on that. But anyway, I remember thinking, this goes to the flying warrants of any of the branches. I remember thinking that they can't land a helicopter here. The trees are too close, and we were taking off at that point, and I remember watching the rotors hit the leaves of the rubber trees. Wow. And there's no way that vehicle could have, that aircraft could have landed there. But it did, so I went back to a MASH unit, and I guess they call them MASH. I know the forward aid station, and remembered we landed, and they had a gurney ready, and all the guys ready to run over the helicopter, and I stepped out and waved at them because the shrapnel literally cut my throat. So I walked on in. They kind of waved at me, and then took the gurney back inside, and I went into the aid station, and they said, they said jump up on the table, and went on the table, and somebody threw a towel across my face, and they were commenced to checking me out. And I remember the doctor was there, called the crew over together, and all the other medics, and said, and gave an anatomy lesson. He said, I'm laying there on my back with a towel over my face, and he said, now gentlemen, guys, this is the aorta, and this is this, and this is that. I remember thinking, now that's odd. And the towel comes off my face, and the guy said, God, you're pretty lucky. This, if that'd been a 1/4 inch or a 1/16, he gave some little bitty number and said, you may not be here, and threw the towel back on my face. So, and then they all commenced to go out to dinner and left somebody to sew me up, one of the technicians, I guess. So, and I got a handful of stitches, and the next thing I knew was they called me up and said, hey, what do you want for dinner? And they said, what are you having? And they said, steak and potatoes. They said, well, bring us 2 trays. And myself and the guy that sewed me up sat there on the gurney, and moved stuff off a little table and sat there and ate in the aid station, so it wasn't too bad.
You also received a Purple Heart, I believe, is that true?
I got a Purple Heart out of that.
Yeah.
I got knocked down once, at the end of Cambodia, we took a major rocket and mortar attack at the fire base shortly before we went out, and I did get knocked down by a mortar round there, and that I learned about what F equals MA means, about what is that, force equals mass something, because it's a little bitty piece of shrapnel knocked me head over heels into the command track, and I was at that point up at waiting for the captain, and when the mortars all started coming in, but it knocked me head over heels inside the track, and I did not get a Purple Heart out of that. It was more of a minor wound, or just but every time I get an X-ray now, the radiologist gets all upset and comes and asks me. He said, we've got a spot on your lungs we need to check out. And I have to say, no. It's a tiny piece of shrapnel. Don't worry about it.
So it's still there.
It's still there, yeah. So it doesn't bother me. It's no big deal. It looks like a BB. In fact, the last time I had an X-ray, the radiologist came around and said, "What's this spherical object in your bag?" I said, "It's just like a BB or something, or if not smaller. But it always shows up, and they always get upset. No big deal." So. But that was toward the end. As time allows, is a thing of that night. I'm hopping around a little bit. The main thing we did in Cambodia was we pretty much did a lot of patrolling along the border, inside Cambodia, outside of Cambodia. Remember I mentioned James O'Brien. Remember we were on patrol and it broke for lunch, and we were sitting there eating, and finished our lunch and mounted back up. He backed up a little bit to get reorganized and blew off all the road wheels on his track, because we had stopped and been eating lunch right on top of a pretty good sized mine, and we had to dust his crew off, but they all came back the next day. When I got dusted off, I got all my stitches and went back, I believe, to wind up in Quan Loy, and checked myself out and felt pretty good about it, and I was bandaged up pretty good. So the next morning I just caught the slick out, and but the Huey, the helicopter, out, and went back to K-Troop the next morning. So the main thing I had to do was keep, watch my throat, and I had one of the medics got the stitches out after I hit a certain point. So that was my claim to fame on that day. So it was an interesting day, the 17th of May. So.
Now, how long after that did you return back to Vietnam, leave Cambodia?
We stayed in and out of Cambodia and the Cambodia area, and came out the last of June. So there were several fire bases, and at one of them was where we had the main, the main mortaring I was talking about. And then that was the night we lost our commo sergeant. Not my platoon, but the troop commo sergeant had stepped away from the command, the operations center when he was in charge of, and the rockets and all came in and took him out. That was the night I was talking about. I got hit in the back and got flipped forward.
Oh, okay.
I was probably within 10 feet of what happened to him, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. We took several casualties that night from that mortaring, but it's interesting. The story like I said, I'd like to get in, was about a month after that, I get a letter from his fiance, and she wanted to know what had happened. And that's something they don't train you to do at any of the schools, And I wasn't sure what I could say or couldn't, but I wrote up as best I could the narrative of what happened that evening. And it was we had regimental paper, we had stationery, it had the regimental stuff across the top and all. But anyway, and sent it off, and never heard anything, back or anything, but let her know that, what we'd gotten mortared, and, a number of people had been injured, and, but she had said that he had spoken, I got her letter because he had spoken about me in one of her letters, in some fashion.
It obviously must have been a complimentary comment for her to...
Possibly. I remember one day he called me and said, "LT, yada yada," he was telling me about something, and I said, "What do you mean by LT?" And I was up in the sky somewhere. He said, "LT is abbreviation for lieutenant. and I, was put in my place immediately, But I don't know why he asked the question really, but he apparently said something, and then but anyway, long story short is about 2, maybe 3 years ago, I stumbled across a memorial site to this guy Milan. He's E6 from Iowa.
Gosh.
And they had 3 email addresses about the people who put the memorial site to him. His family had gotten together and put this site up with pictures of him, tried to keep his memory. And I picked at random one of the email addresses, and just said I knew him. I was there the night he was killed, and this is a great thing you're doing. And in fact, I'd sent his fiance had sent me a letter, and I'd sent back and hoped that the letter had done something. Wow. And it wasn't a day later I got a letter back, and it was her. Really? I had at random picked her email address, and she back and told me what happened. The grief had all come back after all these years. She had married, had a great life, and a good life, but it all came back out. They had been high school sweethearts, and then he went off to war and didn't make it. And then in the course of that email, she still had my letter.
Gee whiz.
And that just blew me away.
Yeah.
So I've been in touch with her, with the family since then over the past 3 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years, something like that. So that was my little story there.
Well, that should make you feel good that you got that contact with her.
Yeah, and the family's kept that memorial site up, so I visited periodically. He was a good guy.
I want to go back to one thing you said earlier.
Yeah.
When you were treating the Vietnamese civilians, what was their behavior towards our soldiers, and you were trying to help them? Did you get the impression that they knew that, or?
The unfortunate thing is we had no one that could speak Vietnamese with us most of the time. We might have a Tiger Scout with us who spoke broken English. Tiger Scouts were sometimes usually the Viet Cong, what they call Chu Hois, if I understood it right, that had surrendered and sworn allegiance, I guess, to the South Vietnamese government, and we had them to help us out. But for the most part, and this is the sad thing, we had trouble corresponding with the Vietnamese. They seemed appreciative, but neutral. A lot of the villagers out there. I remember going online, we were firing in one direction once, and I turned around, my platoon's on line, firing this way, and I turned around to see what was back of us, and it was a field, and the guy was out hoeing corn or something. He was just working his field. And they'd been at war for so long, it was just the way it was. Yeah. So, and I've heard since that the Vietnamese had a saying, things mutually arise, and based on their Buddhism and their religion, that just things just happen is about what it amounts to. I didn't never catch any animosity. I mean, I've been in some, when we went into Cambodia, we went into some of the homes and we made certain nothing was looted or anything like that. There was none of that going on in Cambodia, and the Cambodians were the same way, seemed to be very gentle people, and for the most part, I think they just accommodated. They were so used to the French, and then us, and then the Viet Cong, and all these things. They seemed to be appreciative of the treatment, but beyond that, we had very little contact with the locals, which is a downside of the way we operated.
Yeah. When did you leave Vietnam?
Left in mid-December of 1970 and returned home. After I left my platoon, I became XO for a brief period of time and ran XO, and my main thing I remember there is taking Thanksgiving to the troops on Thanksgiving of 1970. Wow. Took a convoy out, made sure that, like the Army always does, everybody had a hot Thanksgiving meal. Yeah. Wow. At the last couple of weeks, I had virtually nothing to do, and I was under Captain Steve Adair, I believe that's it. I think I've got that right. And like I said, served under Captain John C. Speedy III initially, and he was in Douglas Campbell, but Speedy became a colonel, retired out of colonel, lives in Texas. Steve, the captain, he's up in Ohio. I've not been in touch with him, I just know he's up there. But came home, and family met me at the airport, flew into San Francisco and changed from khakis we had to wear at the time into greens because it was winter. and caught a flight home, and family had a family reunion there at the airport. One of the things I really remember was my brother, who was an art student down at Georgia State, had made a huge sign, says, you know, to welcome me home, and that was in the front yard. The thing must be 20 feet long, and it looked 100 feet to me, but he had that posted out there. And you know, like along the way, I'd you know, met my who became my fiance, Bonnie, and we had our 40th wedding anniversary this past Sunday.
Well, congratulations.
So but I left the Army in March, went back to Southern Tech, got a 4th degree in civil engineering technology, worked in civil engineering for about 3 years, didn't like the design room, too confining, and went back to Georgia State under the VA, got a master's degree in MBA, and joined Hartford Insurance and commercial union insurance and loss control, what they call it, safety and health. And then went with a major insurance brokerage for 23 years, and about 7 years ago started my own, became an independent consultant. So along the way I've picked up things like the a certified safety professional and chartered property casualty underwriter, risk associate risk, picked up a number of little basic stuff, and had a pretty good career after the fact. I have one son, Brian, and who is now a CFO at a corporation. Got a CPA several years ago, and doing well. And my wife is still working with a major bank.
Well, you should be proud of what you've done in your life and what you're still doing. And,
well, this was a small fraction of the, you know, my life. And I look back, you know, 1 year out of the 63, and it's the intensity of the time period and the relationships we were able to achieve. Like working armor, you're working boxes, and the way we operate. I've unfortunately forgotten a number of the men that I served with, and quite frankly, I know some of them were draftees, some of them had the peace symbol, and you can see the, I'm not going to go into what it means, the FTA written on the side of the helmet, and you know, met some good senior officers and captains. But I think they did their fathers justice. I mean, their fathers that were World War II. And a lot of them didn't want to be there, but they did their job. Would I do it again with them? What was it Lee said? It is good that war is so terrible, or we would grow too fond of it. And you know, it was a period of time some people have not been able to put to the side. I think in my case, I've been with I've been able to, you know, shall we say, outlive it. I thoroughly enjoy being with the AVVBA and working with the USO and that aspect, but I'm not one to have that just dominate my life, and it made my life, and I still use the findings, the training I received at the infantry school, and the lessons learned from Jerry Weath and James O'Brien and Cyrus Dodd, and the lessons learned from John Speedy and Doug Campbell and Steve Vader, and every day you think about it, but you know, just use the lessons and moved on. Hopefully. Do you have any questions?
Well, before we finish, is there anything else you would like to say about your experiences, or any message you'd like to deliver? The message you just delivered is very profound, and we appreciate that. But if there's anything else you'd like to say, please feel free to do so.
Hopefully I've kind of covered the basics of my experience to a degree that it helps out, you know, down the road. If nothing else, it's how you can ricochet around in life. You know, I enlist to become a land surveyor, wind up at the infantry school, wind up in an armor unit, wind up in some situations that kind of put me in, you wonder how you got out of them. When I add up the number of times that I shouldn't be here, it's kind of interesting to see the high count. So I'm very fortunate that I serve with good men, and at the right point in the right time. So.
Well, I'll say again, you should be very proud of both your military service and what you did before and what you've done since
I appreciate
military
it.
service. And You're obviously a brave man, and we're proud of what you did. I want to thank you for what you did for the country.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm not sure whether serendipity or bravery. You just do it, you know. And frankly, I was never was I in a situation where, like some of the guys, like the platoon leader, one of the other lieutenants, John Caswell, who's now in Niceville, Florida, and where he's has to go online and assault a village because the NVA are in a knockdown drag out with the local rough and puffs, the regional forces, or some of my LTs from OCS where they got into ambushes, or where you're eyeball to eyeball with the enemy. That doesn't happen with armor. The platoon leader after me, that took my platoon, John, when he got every time I think he went out the front door, something happened to him. So where you're sitting there with the NVA or the Viet Cong in most cases right side by side with your tracks, and I was fortunate not to have to get into quite that type of a scrape. Anything that shows up on my record or anything is not mine. I don't consider it mine. And I'm almost like I think it's the Israeli army that doesn't give awards. I think sometimes I think we ought to be that way, because in looking at like the after action review we talked about and seeing how things get written up, and you see what's in the written words, sometimes the perception is different, after the fact than what really is there. I think it all belongs to the whole group and not individuals in this case.
Well, I agree with you, but you did your job and you did it well, and we appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay.